Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you again, many of you. So, I'll be giving two talks. The first one is called The Secret of Life. Yesterday in our satsanga, in the question and answer, one of the things I mentioned was that when I was talking about the question of how I came to Vedanta, one of the things that really appeals to me about Vedanta is that it's not a preachy religion and it's not a religion of fear, based on fear. Whereas many other religions are, if you don't do this, then you'll go to hell, you'll burn for an eternity, these kind of, you get terrified and then you become religious for the wrong reasons. That's not Vedanta. It doesn't make us feel guilty about what we're doing or not doing. It doesn't tell us we're sinners. And when I first read Swami Vivekananda, one of the statements he made I found especially powerful and inspiring as a student. And that's going to form the kind of overarching theme of this entire talk. Swami Vivekananda, he said, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. This is the essence of Vedanta. Experience is our greatest teacher. If we want to do something, do it, but do it mindfully. That's what Vedanta says. Whatever you want to experience, go ahead and do it, but experience it mindfully. And ask yourself, what does it mean to experience something mindfully? It means ask yourself whether you get out of it what you were looking for. I was expecting something, let me do it. Did I get out of it what I was looking for? Yes or no, or something in between. And be honest. I think that's what Vedanta is all about. How might Swamiji's teaching be relevant now in 2024? He said it in the late 19th century. Is it relevant now? I think it's more relevant than ever. Why? Because we're living in an unprecedented age. What's unprecedented about it? There are many things that are unprecedented about it. In this context, I would suggest we're living in an unprecedented age of instant gratification. Never in the history of humanity has it been so easy, so tempting. It's not just about being easy, but it's almost, it's shoved in our faces. We can experience and get whatever we want, whenever we want, in whatever quantity we want. Unlimited bhoga, enjoyment. This is just not true this was not true in the past. I grew up in the 80s and early 90s, pre-internet. And I loved TV when I was growing up. But when I wanted to watch a show, I'd have to wait an entire week for the next episode to come out. Now what? Binge watching. There's a term for it. There's a term for everything now. Binge watching. You can watch an entire season of Game of Thrones or whatever it is your favorite thing is in one day. Right? No, you don't have to wait for anything anymore. Pornography is ubiquitous throughout the world. Dating sites, this, that, a million things. Social media. You have these brilliant programmers who've developed these extremely sophisticated algorithms to hook you. The moment you click on one video or like one reel or whatever they call them on Instagram, I don't use social media, so I don't know. What happens? The algorithm kicks back 10 more of those kind of videos, but increasingly sensational and kind of, so that you get sucked into this vortex of addiction. It's a kind of addiction. It's what contemporary scientists call behavioral addiction. In the past, the only main addiction was substance addictions, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, and so on and so forth. Now it's this brand new epidemic of behavioral addiction. And Jean Lemke, a Stanford psychotherapist, she wrote a book called Dopamine Nation. She says that the modern day smartphone is like a hypodermic needle, a 24/7 hypodermic needle. Imagine a heroin addict who has a syringe on him at all times. That's literally what it is. It's in our pockets. So one small tip that she gives, which is very helpful, if you are addicted to social media, one really helpful thing to do is to just say, I will only use social media on larger devices, whether that's a tablet like an iPad or a laptop. Because what happens? That means you're not going to be able to use social media on your phone anymore. And that eliminates a huge number of distractions. And because we're always getting these notifications, ping, ping, bung, bung, at all times. They might even go off in the midst of this talk. So now, we live in this unprecedented age. We get whatever we want, whenever we want, in whatever quantity we want. Logically, you might think, isn't that great? Shouldn't we celebrate this fact? Wonderful. That's the beauty of modern technology, internet, and all these other things. Not so great. That's the problem. You would think that we'd be happier than ever, and yet we are more miserable than ever. That's what I would call the paradox of instant gratification. There was a Mental Health America study published last year in 2023 called The State of Mental Health in America. Over 50 million Americans suffer from mental illness. Even pre-pandemic, these are figures that were already bad, and they were just exacerbated by the pandemic. Millions of adults in the US experience serious thoughts of suicide. Over 1 in 10 youth in the US are experiencing depression that is severely impairing their ability to function at school or work, at home, with family, or in their social life. So it's a massive problem. It's a massive problem. We're less happy than we were before all these modern technologies came. This is the paradox of instant gratification. So I want to explore briefly this paradox. Let's try to understand why this is the case. And what is the secret of life? How do we achieve genuine happiness, joy, contentment, fulfillment in this life? In the West, I think the field that's most helpful in understanding this and answering this question is positive psychology. It's a burgeoning field, relatively new. Old psychology is about making us, quote unquote, normal. We have some kind of mental illness, and it tries to make us normal, whatever that means. Positive psychology starts where old psychology leaves off. It says even once you're normal, once you're free from any kind of debilitating mental illness, then life begins. How do we flourish in life? That's the question that positive psychology asks. And it gives some very insightful and profound answers that have really interesting links with Vedanta. So in India, our most valuable resource for answering the same question, how do we find fulfillment in life? How do we flourish in life? How do we find genuine happiness and contentment in life? Vedanta. So what I want to do briefly is to bring into dialogue some of the insights from positive psychology on the one hand and Vedanta on the other, and see how they can kind of mutually support and illuminate each other. I also want to argue a little bit more contentiously as a Vedantin that there are some gaps, some holes, some missing elements in Western positive psychology that I think Vedanta can help fill. So that's another aspect of the talk today. I want to focus on a really influential book in positive psychology called Authentic Happiness by somebody who's considered to be kind of the father of positive psychology. His name is Martin Seligman. He's a professor at UPenn, I think, University of Pennsylvania. This book was published in 2002. And he distinguishes 3 different ways of living life. He says the first kind of life is the pleasant life. Second is the good life. And the third is the meaningful life. Pleasant life, good life, meaningful life. So I'm going to use this to structure the talk. So let's start with the pleasant life. What does he mean by that? Pleasant life is one that's based primarily on instant gratification, easy pleasures. And as I said, this is the time we're living in now presents unprecedented opportunities for instant gratification. It's very hard to resist. And what Sullivan says, based on a whole host of scientific studies, is that living a life based on maximizing pleasure, a kind of hedonistic life, is a recipe for unhappiness. Okay? You're all sitting here today probably because you already know that in a sense. But let me just mention a few things from the positive psychology side to kind of illustrate this. In 1972, there's a famous scientific experiment conducted by a Stanford scientist named Walter Mischel. It's the famous marshmallow experiment. So he brings in these 4-year-olds, one at a time, and he tells the 4-year-old, here's a delicious marshmallow, places that on a plate in front of the kid, says, you can eat that right now, or I'm going to leave the room for 15 minutes. If you can hold out for 15 minutes, when I come back, I'll reward you with 2 marshmallows. Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, that's what the kids are very excited. All right. Scientist leaves the room. They're videotaping the whole thing. And it's really funny to watch the kids and how some of them will just immediately, the moment he leaves, marshmallows in the mouth, digested. But some of the kids, they try desperately to avoid eating the marshmallow. So they kind of try to distract themselves, twiddle their thumbs, look around. They start singing or humming to themselves. It's really very funny. Anyway, what happens? What's the result of the experiment? It turns out that among all the kids that were involved in this experiment, 2 out of 3 could not hold out for the 15 minutes. They succumbed to temptation. They ate the 1 marshmallow before the 15 minutes was up. 1 out of 3, so the minority, 1/3, they were able to hold out for those 15 minutes. And then they got rewarded with the 2 marshmallows. But the story doesn't end there. It was a longitudinal study, which means that it's long term, over the course of decades. The same scientist revisits these kids decades later when they're in their, I think, either late teens or early 20s. And he asks them and finds out how they, basically their life outcomes across a number of measures. What are some of those measures? SAT scores in high school, educational attainment, body mass index, how healthy they are, mental health, and other life measures. And the findings are striking. Those kids who at 4 years old, that 1 out of 3, who were able to hold out for 15 minutes, had much better life outcomes than the 2 out of 3 who couldn't hold out. It's a very telling study. What does it mean? It means that delaying gratification is the recipe for a more long-term, long-lasting fulfillment and satisfaction. And this is really what Vedanta also teaches. We're going to get to that when we get to the Vedantic side of the talk. But before we get to Vedanta and other things, just common sense will tell us the same thing. Look back on your own life and ask yourself, what made me most happy? What makes me most fulfilled in my life? Are you going to go back and think that it was that delicious piece of cake I had in Spain? Maybe, but most people will say it's the things I had to work at. It's my loving relationship with my husband, for instance, my relationship with my kids. I had to spend many sleepless nights raising my kids, but it was all worth it because see what a wonderful person she is now. I find fulfillment in work, for instance, but is that something that's easy? No, you had to work at it for years, slaving away, facing all sorts of challenges, right? The really meaningful things in life tend to be things that require hard work, perseverance, and the joys don't come instantly. They come a bit later, delayed gratification. But those are the real sources of meaning in life, right? Just from a common sense standpoint. So now, I'm going to skip quite a bit because this talk is actually much longer, but we don't have that much time. I'll mention one other thing. This is quite interesting. A Swiss scientist named Christian Lüscher, he conducted a number of experiments involving mice. So there's a cage, and on one side of the cage, he puts this device with a lever. And every time the mouse pushes a lever, it gets a dopamine high. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that makes you feel good and gives you motivation. It just gets a straight shot of dopamine into the brain. Okay, so first experiment. He puts the mouse in the cage and sees what happens. The mouse sheepishly walks over to the lever, pushes it once, and gets this amazing burst of dopamine. So what does it do? Kind of obvious, you can guess. It doesn't stop. And then the scientist, Christian Lucia, says if after 2 hours we didn't take them out of the cage, they wouldn't eat, they wouldn't drink, then they would probably die quickly, but very happily. Now he does a variant on the same experiment. Same mice who have already gone through this first experiment. Same lever with the dopamine device. In between the mouse on the one side and the lever on the other, he places an electrically charged grid, which is very painful to the mouse as it steps on it. So now the question is, will the mouse sacrifice its own pleasure and endure that pain in order to push that lever? The answer is yes. And the other interesting thing is the way that it's kind of a cruel experiment, frankly, but even after it reaches the lever, it's still stuck on the grid. So every time it hits the lever, it's still feeling that excruciating pain. It's still getting electrocuted. And yet it won't desist. It'll keep pushing that lever. And every time it pushes the lever, it's getting that burst of joy and at the same time feeling the terrible pain from getting electrocuted. This reminds me of something Sri Ramakrishna used to say. He said, worldly people are like camels trying to get that tiny bit of juice from the cactus tree. In spite of the fact that all the needles constantly pricking it, making its gums bleed, and yet it won't stop. And you might think, looking at the camel, are you crazy? But it wants a tiny bit of juice and is willing to endure so much agony and suffering for the sake of that tiny bit of worldly juice. You see, this is the situation of the mice in this experiment. But what Vedanta tells us is that it's not just these poor mice. We are the poor mice. Most of us are no different from these mice. How do we avoid becoming these mice? How do we graduate from mice to human beings? That's the question, which Vedanta helps us to answer. So one thing that's very helpful on the Vedantic side is the scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. It's a very, very practical spiritual manual. It teaches the highest spiritual and philosophical teachings. But I want to focus on the Gita's view on happiness. Very practical, very profound, and very relevant in contemporary times. Chapter 18, verses 37 to 39, distinguishes 3 different kinds of happiness based on the 3 gunas. The gunas are sattva, rajas, and tamas. Sattva is a guna. If you have a lot of sattva guna, you're people who are very sattvic. They tend to be humble, not so egoistic, not arrogant. They tend to be compassionate, ethical, devotional, spiritual, all the good things, kind of an ethical and spiritual life. Calm. People who have a lot of rajas tend to be full of desires, ambitions, kind of restless. Often they're kind of hyperactive. Like if you give them 5 minutes of downtime, they start freaking out. Highly tamasic people with a lot of tamas, tend to be lazy, procrastinators, sleep a lot, these kinds of things. And also unmindful, just kind of, they go through life kind of mechanically and sort of going through the motions, but without thinking about things for themselves. So now, Gita, how does Gita explain? We'll start with Rajasika happiness. Okay, this is 18.38. Vishayendriya sanyogat yat tat agre mritopamam pariname vishimiva tatsukam rajasamsritam. Rajasika happiness is happiness that derives from the contact of the sense organs with sense objects. In the beginning, sense pleasure is like nectar, amrita. In the end, it becomes like poison. So in one verse from over 1,000 years ago, the Bhagavad Gita explains why pleasant life, why a life based on instant gratification is doomed to make us unhappy. Why do we indulge in instant gratification so much? Because of that nectar in the beginning. Ultimately, though, what happens? Inevitably, that nectar turns into poison. And we know it. After undergoing the same experience a few times, we know it. Yet somehow, Maya is such that we keep doing the same thing again, even though we know that in the end, the nectar will turn into poison. And this is the tragedy. We suffer from a kind of radical delusion. And we convince ourselves that, no, next time I do it, somehow it'll just stay as nectar. And yet it never happens. It's never the case, right? So what is that poison? In what sense does the nectar of instant gratification turn into poison? Sri Aurobindo, he wrote a giant commentary on the Bhagavad Gita called Essays on the Gita. So in his commentary on this verse, he says something I think very helpful. As spiritual aspirants, I think it's really useful. He says, Rajasika joy is nectar to the lips at the first touch, but there is a secret poison in the bottom of the cup. And after it, the bitterness of disappointment, you're not getting out of it what you thought you would get out of it. Satiety, it's just too much. Fatigue, tired. Revolt, it's a kind of feeling of disgust with yourself. He also says that revolt, disgust, sin, suffering, loss, transience. And he ends with transience. Transience is the most universal problem. It's true about all forms of instant gratification and instant pleasure. No matter how great it is, it doesn't last. It doesn't last forever. That's why the first noble truth of Buddhism, everything is suffering and everything is anityam. Everything is suffering because nothing lasts. This is the problem. Even more deeply, another Vedantic scripture explains why it is that when we try to satisfy our worldly desires, we always end up becoming less happy in the end. This is from chapter 9 of the Bhagavata Purana. Na jatu kamaha kamanam upabhogyena shamyati habisha krishnavatmeva bhuya eva vibhaddhate. Desires are never satisfied through bhoga, upabhoga, which means enjoyment. Most of us think that I have a desire, let me get the object of desire, and then I'll be happy. Never works. Why? This Bhagavata Purana uses a nice analogy. It says, if you've got a fire going and you want to put out the fire, what do? You should take water to the fire, right? But this brilliant person takes oil and pours oil into the fire. What happens? The fire gets much larger, much bigger, right? The Indian term is ghee, clarified butter, but I'm just modifying. That's what happens. The more we try to satisfy our desires, the hungrier we become. The more insatiable our desires become, the more intense our desires become. Krishna says the same thing in chapter 3 of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna describes kama, desire, as mahashano, mahapapma, all devouring, insatiable. It's like you have a little guinea pig pet and you feed it, gets bigger, and it wants twice the amount of food you're giving it, and it will never stop. And then it grows so big that it breaks out of the cage and it starts terrifying you. That's desire. So what's the better route to happiness? As spiritual aspirants, we should try to reduce our desires instead of trying to constantly feed them and satisfy them. Another Vedantic scripture, Vairagya Shatakam, 100 verses on renunciation, on detachment. There's a beautiful mantra which gives totally different and new way of thinking about what true wealth is and what true poverty is. Sattu bhavati daridro yasya trishna vishala manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridraha. That person is daridra, poor. Yasya trishna vishala, whose desires are great. You can be Elon Musk, you can be the richest person in the world and be unhappy. And be poor in a deeper spiritual sense if you are full of desires that are not satisfied. Manasi cha paritushte kortavan ko daridra. And when the mind is satisfied, who is rich and who is poor? So for that villager in India or in Africa who's satisfied with $5 a month and has fewer desires than Elon Musk, that person is richer than the Elon Musk. Just think about it. So that's a lot on the pleasant life and the problems with the pleasant life. So that's all kind of the negative side of the talk. We should not live a life based primarily on instant gratification. How should we live life? That's the next question. This is where the next two paradigms of living come in. Martin Seligman says we should try to live the good life. That's the first step. What is a good life according to Seligman? He says primarily it consists of two steps. Number one, identify your signature strengths. Identify your signature strengths. And number two, find a vocation, calling, a line of work, a way of being in the world that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths on a daily basis. That's it. That's the good life. It's not complete. Then ultimately we have to get to the meaningful life, but it's a very, very important part of finding fulfillment in life and authentic happiness. And interestingly, yeah.
Second point for good life.
Two things. Number one, identify your signature strengths. Number two, live your life in such a way that you're able to cultivate those signature strengths on a daily basis. That's the idea. Yeah. Now, if we go to Vedanta, Vedanta says exactly the same thing, but they said it a long time ago, before scientific studies were out about this. Bhagavad Gita says leading a good life involves, number one, identify your swadharma. The term used in the Gita, the Sanskrit term is swadharma. Try to find out your own unique law of being based on your inner strengths and weaknesses. That, incidentally, is the true caste system. The word caste system obviously has terrible connotations, but the true caste system is based on guna and karma, not on heredity. You're not born as a Brahmin. You have to earn the right to be a Brahmin based on your guna and your karma. Guna means your own innate qualities, tendencies, temperament, and karma means your behavior, how you live, how you interact with others on a daily basis. That determines your varna, your caste. That's just swadharma. And then you find a way of, you find a lifestyle, a vocation, a calling that helps you to cultivate your strengths, your gunas and your karmas, your signature strengths on a daily basis. So here, Vedanta and modern positive psychology, I think, will happily agree and kind of support each other. At the same time, I think there's something missing in Seligman's account of the good life. He says that there are two main steps. Number one, identify your signature strengths. Number two, find a vocation, a line of work that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths regularly. The third step, which Vedanta adds, which is missing from positive psychology in general, I don't think it's just Seligman's book, but I think it's in general, is the following. It's not enough to just follow these two steps. The third step is convert your karma into karma yoga. Because the motive with which you engage in your work matters tremendously. You could be doing wonderful work that helps you to cultivate your inner strengths, your signature strengths, everything. But if you do it selfishly and egoistically, it's still going to be a recipe for unhappiness in the end. Whereas, if you can try to take the ego out of the work, if you're a bhakta, if you're a devotee, then do the work as an offering to the divine, as Krishna suggests again and again. Chapter 9. Yat karoshi, yadashnasi, yadjuhoshi, dadasiyat. Yat tapassi kaunteya tatkurushva madarpanam. Whatever it is you do, forget about just meditation, pujas, spiritual practice. Literally anything you do, eating, talking to friends, do it as an offering to the divine. The moment you do that, that karma turns into karma yoga. So that's the crucial missing third step in leading the good life, which I think Vedanta can help us to appreciate, which is missing, I think, from Western positive psychology. And finally, the meaningful life. The meaningful life. Seligman says, even leading the good life is not enough. What's missing is an overarching meaning or purpose to life. That's the idea. Whatever work we're doing, if we just do it for ourselves, it's not good enough. We need to have some kind of higher purpose in view. We need a kind of a higher aim in life. That's the idea behind the meaningful life. And the thing is, Seligman himself doesn't consider himself to be spiritual or religious. He's basically an atheist. So he doesn't believe in God. And he wants to be inclusive enough in his understanding of the meaningful life to include atheists and agnostics. And so what he says is, even being an environmental activist, for instance, could give you that source of meaning that you're looking for. Environmental, any kind of activism, any kind of higher purpose that goes beyond just you and your immediate family, let's say, and your immediate circle. Here again, I think Vedanta would say that's not good enough. It's too broad. And that higher purpose or meaning in life needs to be ultimately eternal and transcendental. Something that lasts forever. Why? Well, because Swami Vivekananda used to say, this world is like a dog's curly tail. Every time you straighten out the tail, what happens? It curls back up again, right? And so at the end of the day, no matter how great an activist you are, and no matter how much you help the environment through your efforts, and I'm not saying you should not engage in activism, please don't misunderstand me. That's not the point. But ultimately, it'll never be good enough. There'll always be the next cause, and you're never going to be able to save the world with your efforts. So activism could be a very important part of your life, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but it can't be the ultimate purpose. There has to be a transcendental purpose, a transcendental meaning beyond all these things that is untouched by Maya, untouched by the ravages of time. And what is that? That highest purpose is the realization of our true, eternal, spiritual nature. So this brings me to the Gita's definition of sattvika happiness. As I talked about rajasika happiness, any form of sense pleasure, instant gratification, which is like poison, like nectar in the beginning, but ultimately becomes like poison. What does Gita say about sattvika joy? Sattvika joy. Yat tat agre vishameva pariname mritopamam tat sukham sattvikam proktam atma buddhi prasadajam. It has exactly the opposite structure of rajasika joy. Those joys which are like poison in the beginning and which become like nectar in the end are sattvika joys. And then the last Sanskrit phrase is very evocative and profound from a psychological standpoint and from a spiritual standpoint. The phrase is, sattvika joys are atma buddhi prasada jam. Jam means born. Prasada means satisfaction in this context, most likely. There's some possibility of different interpretations, but this is how I take it. Sattvika happiness derives from the satisfaction of what? Atma and buddhi. Buddhi means the higher mind. There's our lower mind with the lower impulses, almost kind of akin to the lower animals, the non-human animals. And then there is the higher mind, which values the better things in life, being ethical, appreciating the beauty of nature, high art, these kinds of things. And of course, spiritual life and spiritual practice. But even more fundamentally, Atma. Sattvika joys, instead of gratifying the body-mind complex, which is the structure of all instant gratification, instant pleasures, it gratifies the deeper soul within, the eternal soul. By definition, sattvika joy is that which gratifies our eternal soul rather than the body-mind complex. So what Vedanta teaches us, this is another thing that's missing, I think, from positive psychology. What Vedanta teaches us is the way to lead a happy life. It's not just about leading the good life based on your swadharma, your signature strengths, finding a line of work that helps you to cultivate those signature strengths. Third, convert your karma into karma yoga. All that's important. But also, as spiritual aspirants, on a daily basis, we should try to make our lives as sattvic as possible. How do we make every single action that we engage in, every activity, every interaction we have with others as sattvic as possible? This is spiritual practice. And this is a recipe for genuine fulfillment and flourishing in life. So let me give you a couple practical examples. Many of you are married or are in some kind of relationship with a partner. Is your relationship with your partner sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic? Very important question, not asked often enough, I think, by spiritual aspirants. What do I mean? Tamasic relationship will be one that sort of where you kind of neglect each other. Oh, you do whatever you want, I'll do whatever I want. There isn't much love or caring in that relationship. Not a recipe for happiness or for spiritual fulfillment. What's rajasic a relationship like with your loved one, your romantic partner, your spouse? Unhealthy codependence, clingy, way too attached to each other, to the point where if your partner goes off for a business trip for 2 days, you freak out, you can't live with yourself, you're constantly on the phone with him or her. Rajasic. Sattvic. What's a sattvic relationship? You walk side by side with your partner. Your life partners, your best friends, And yet, without that clinging, without that unhealthy codependence, you support each other, you love each other, but in a more spiritual way. What about your relationship with your kids? Many of you have kids. How do you raise your kids? What's your parenting style? Is it sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic? What's tamasic parenting? Oh, you do whatever you want. I don't care. And the parent might pride him or herself on being a great parent because you give their kid independence. I'm letting them do whatever they want. No, that's tamasic. Letting your kid do whatever you want is not sattvic parenting. What's rajasic parenting? It's what Americans call helicopter parenting. You hover over your kid, micromanage them. You tell your kid, unless you do X, Y, and Z, you're going to be a failure. You have to do what I want. Very egoistic. Sattvic parenting. You give your kid the space, the breathing room to grow in his or her own way. You recognize their strengths, their weaknesses, and you help them to cultivate their strengths. You help them to overcome their weaknesses compassionately, lovingly, non-judgmentally, without forcing your own ideas and aims and goals in life onto your kid, foisting them onto your kid, which is typically a recipe for unhappiness. What about your relationship with your coworkers? You go to work. Most of us spend most of our day working. How are we working? And how do we interact with our coworkers, our boss? Is it sattvic? Is it rajasic? Is it tamasic? So this three gunas framework is incredibly powerful and helpful and practical on a daily basis for asking ourselves, how can we spiritualize every moment of our lives? Because one of the big mistakes that spiritual aspirants make is to think that when I walk into the shrine here and sit for meditation for 20 or 30 minutes, that's spiritual life, that's spiritual practice. Or when I attend a satsang, once I walk out that door, real life begins, worldly life begins. Now I'm in samsara. No, why make that bifurcation in the first place? Nivedita, Sister Nivedita, one of Swami Vivekananda's greatest disciples and also one of his most astute interpreters, she wrote the introduction to his complete works. And there's a beautiful statement there. She says one of his main messages was, henceforth, no distinction between sacred and secular. No distinction between sacred and secular. No such thing as spiritual life and the rest of my life. And these tips that we get from positive psychology and that we get from the Bhagavad Gita can help us to spiritualize every moment of our lives. It's not just about, but of course, it does matter, the quality of our spiritual practice. I mean the practice that we do in the shrine, because that's another important thing. We can do japa. For many of you are initiated, you're given some kind of mantra, and your guru tells you, you should mentally repeat that mantra. How are we doing it? The tamasic way of doing it is what? You're doing it. I've seen this a lot, actually, even in monasteries, because you have to wake up very early. Tamasic japa. Mechanically, you're obviously your mind is elsewhere. It's in slumberland. Rajasika, doing your spiritual practice in a rajasic way means what? Imagine you're doing the same kind of japa. This time you're not sleeping, you're alert. But where's your mind? Thinking about what you're going to cook for lunch. Why did that person say that to me? And this and that. Thinking about 100 things other than God and other than the mantra itself, the meaning and significance of the mantra. Rajasic japa, rajasic spiritual practice. And another aspect of it, which Ramakrishna he was a great psychologist and he understood this very beautifully. He said, what's the difference between a very sattvic spiritual aspirant and a rajasika one? The sattvika one is extraordinarily unassuming and humble and has absolutely no external show. Not at all, has zero image consciousness. The rajasika spiritual aspirant is all about the externals. What he wears, how he comes off to others. And he wants to make sure that when he does spiritual practices, others are aware of it. So Swami will say, that's the kind of a rajasic spiritual aspirant, somebody who will wear a necklace of rosary beads strewn with gems to attract attention and pray in such a way that others are noticing. And he hopes that later that other people will say, that guy, he sat for meditation for 2 hours. Can you believe it? It's incredible. There's a secret desire for name and fame. There's an ego behind it. That's rajasic spiritual practices. Sattvika spiritual practice, Sri Ramakrishna will say, is like somebody who, in the middle of the night, when everybody's fast asleep, inside his or her mosquito net, because in India, mosquitoes are a terrible plague. That person is spending most of the night doing spiritual practices, might wake up late. Other people might say you're a lazy bum. that person will say nothing. Who cares what other people think about you? Who cares whether they know how much spiritual practice you're doing or not? The moment you have that desire to impress others, that's ego. And Mahamaya, she has a way of grabbing you with her jugular, even as a spiritual aspirant. That's the danger in spiritual life. It's like walking on the edge of a razor. You think, I'm a monk, I'm doing everything right, I've renounced the world for God. And yet Mahamaya can trap you as a monk or as a nun. Any spiritual aspirant, just coming to the temple is not enough. Of course, it's very important, but it's not enough. We have to analyze motives. We have to be very, very careful about where ego can creep in to even creep into even our most so-called spiritual activities. Okay, so finally, just to sum up, what is the secret of life? As Swami Vivekananda used to say, the secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. What do we learn through the school of hard knocks? Through experience. We will never attain lasting fulfillment, happiness. We will never flourish if we live a merely pleasant life based on instant gratifications. We should try to combine what Martin Seligman calls the good life with a meaningful life based on a spiritual purpose. And then we will find ultimate fulfillment. Thank you. So questions? Yes. Who's going to select people? Should I, or should I call on people? Yeah. Oh, so please raise your hand and then I'll call on you. Yeah. And say your name and then give me your question. Thank you.
Especially notion of education to experience. So a couple of observations from my life. Martin Seligman's framework makes sense, but it's also a continuum and aligns really well with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? The other thing is the notion of meaningful life. Personally, I've delved into that really well. The most useful framework I've come across is the Japanese notion of ikigai, which is four elements, right? What are you passionate about? How are you good at it? Can you actually meaningfully make a livelihood from it? How does it contribute back to society? So it's literally finding.
That's nice. But again, isn't that karma yoga element missing? Yeah. I think Vedanta really has something valuable that all of these paradigms are missing.
Yeah. But it's very pragmatic and meaningful.
No, that's nice. Yeah.
And apply to my life. Hopefully, the other interesting thing is tamasic, rajasic, and sattvic. Yeah. It's again, I don't think you stay in any one state.
Oh, that's certainly true.
You can jump between states, which is, I think, when I started tamasic, I got to rajasic.
Yeah.
Found spirituality and sattvic, and I think traverse all three states, which is
no, that's right. I think that's right. I mean, in any given time, we're a mixture of all three gunas, but one predominates. That's the way to see it. And then what you are trying to do is change the mixture such that the predominant quality is is sattva rather than rajas and tamas. And of course, at different times of the day, one of those gunas might kind of rear its head more than the others. And so then we should be ready for that. When we're feeling very tamasic, maybe before we go to bed or maybe right when we wake up, what do we do? And how do we keep our minds high? So we should ask ourselves that. What do we do when we're feeling very rajasic? One of the great things is exercise. I'm big on exercise because I call it a kind of sattvika form of rajas. It's rajasic in the sense that you have to move the body and doing things. You're pushing yourself physically, mentally, but it's sattvic. Why? Because number one, it's a form of bodily austerity. You're taxing your body. It's literally what it is. You're pushing your body. That itself is helping you, if you do it with a spiritual attitude, to break your identification with the body. In fact, ultramarathoners, like really high-level athletes, they talk about how when they're in this really deep flow state, when they are taxing their body to the utmost, they actually feel kind of lifted up from away from their body, and they don't feel any pain. It's extraordinary. That's how is that not a spiritual experience?
Thank you. I've got to state, these were some of the most meaningful and insightful discourses I've encountered at conferences.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you again, Maharaj. It's a great talk once again. And like 3 questions, but I'll ask one right now. So we learned that education through experience. Whose experience are we talking about? Does it have to be an individual's experience all the time for all education? And I'm asking this question specifically because do we put a bound on what sort of education we want? That is, what sort of we can have so many different types of education and experience. Like you mentioned a few bad ones, like should we have a bound or
Should we have a what?
bound, like limit?
Oh, I see. Look, I mean,
So, I mean, just
yeah, no, I mean, I get the question. It's just, I mean, we learn through experience that we have to set boundaries for ourselves,
yeah, so
you know, and sometimes it requires hitting rock bottom before we realize that.
and it kind of connects to the first part of the question, that do you always have to learn through our experience or through somebody else?
No, yeah, I mean, one thing that Swami Brahmanandaji used to say, he said he distinguished three classes of people. And he said, very worldly people, they undergo the same experience again and again, and yet they don't learn from it. That education through experience is not happening in their case. They see other people going through the same experience, don't learn from it. But forget about it. They go through the same experience again and they don't learn from it. Second class, he says, this is a much more evolved kind of spiritual aspirant. And he says, this is the person who will try to learn from the experiences of others, whether good or bad, and will have to undergo both good and bad experiences, him or herself, couple times, once, twice, and then the bounds that you, and then they're like, wait a minute, I figured out that this is not the way to happiness and to fulfillment. Let me stop. I said, but there's a third class, the highest class, a spiritual aspirant. People like Buddha. Well, Buddha is actually complicated because he did marry and he had a kingdom. But no, so forget about Buddha. But the highest class is what? The highest category is the following. You don't undergo those experiences yourself, but you will learn by just observing other people's experiences. You see, he says that person. Sri Ramakrishna will say it's like that bird or a bird high up in the sky lays an egg. Yeah, the Homa bird, and the egg, the chick hatches in the air, and before it gets dashed to the ground, what happens? It flies upward. So it refuses to be tainted by any worldliness. The Nitya Siddhas, the ever perfect, that are in that category. People who learn from the experiences of others, you don't have to undergo the experiences yourself. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a very good question. Mm-hmm.
How to identify the purpose of life?
Yeah, Vedanta helps us, right? What's the purpose of life? God realization or self-realization. Notice how I say both. And we talked about this yesterday about how there are many nuances even within Vedanta about what exactly self-realization is, who is God or what is God, and what is God realization. But take one of those two ideals as your ultimate purpose in life. Either realize your higher self, your eternal self, and or realize God. Sri Ramakrishna would say, Bhagavan Labh Manush Jivanar Uddesho. The aim of life is to realize God. This is one of the keynotes of his teachings. Always keep that in mind. If you cringe at the word God, don't use the word God. You can replace it with divine. If you don't like divine, it sounds too theistic or something, use self. And the beauty of Vedanta is that it's very broad and it doesn't force you to realize the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality in one narrow way. There's some form of Vedanta for everyone. Yeah, I hope that answers their question. Anyone else? Yes, please. Just wait for the mic, please. And tell me your name.
Yeah, this all.
Gopal.
The question is just to mention.
Can you put the mic closer? Hold it closer to your mouth too, yeah.
Is it good?
Yeah.
So yesterday you mentioned about the self-realization,
Mhm.
and then you talked about the kind of a mind and ego.
Yeah.
And so the way couple of places which I just think for you gave an example of a spider, how it builds. It's all about the mind which we are creating the world. If we just kind of think about
Mike, closer to the mouth.
the construction of the world is your imagination, which is coming out of your mind. If we can just kind of quiet the mind, does it go into the self? And that's where the self-realization, just basically you are not looking at the other things. Desires also falls into that place where you don't desires kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate on that?
Okay. I mean, so the thing is, the way you frame that question already presupposes a particular philosophical paradigm. It's the paradigm of a particular sub-school within classical Advaita Vedanta. thinking of the world as a projection of the mind is not just, you can't even just say it's classical Advaita. It's called Drishti Srishtivada. Ramana Maharshi accepted that view, and there are many other great saints who did. Gaudapada's Mandukya Karika, have you heard of that? Has anyone read it or watched Sarvapriyanji's classes on this? There's a famous Karika there. Yatha swapne dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha. Tatha jagrat dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha. Just as the mind projects a world in the state of dream, exactly in the same way, the mind in the waking state is projecting this entire world. So then I, as a follower of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, will say I reject the premise because I don't believe that the world is a projection of the mind. I believe that the world is a manifestation of the divine, a real manifestation of the divine, and that so it's Advaita. But we talked about this yesterday. But so everything depends on your paradigm, and so if you like the Ramana Maharshi paradigm, then you have to ask. You're going to end up asking specific questions about it, which can pose problems. I think one of the advantages of the Vijnana Vedanta kind of philosophical framework is that you don't have these difficulties. The world is not unreal. It's a real manifestation of the divine. Did that answer the question? Or yeah, thank you. There's someone in the back, and then yeah, we'll come to you next. Yeah, thanks.
Maharaj, you were talking about the marshmallow
Experiment, yeah.
The idea that it sort of illustrates a deeper idea, which is the difference between denial and detachment. In terms of you deny yourself the marshmallow, hoping that you'll get the two later, or you're totally detached and you say, you know,
yeah,
I don't even want to consider it. Let me see what happens. This idea of difference between we confuse one for the other in many of our practices. Could you elaborate a little bit on how to distinguish between?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, the thing is, these are 4-year-olds, remember, and so they're not exactly spiritual aspirants, most of them. So yeah, it's not looking at how being a spiritual aspirant makes for a better life, but even something as simple as holding off for 15 minutes to just have sense enjoyment, but even more of it, itself leads to much better life outcomes and more happiness. Ultimately, to graduate to a spiritual aspirant, I think it's nice the way you put it is that ultimately detachment is even better than delaying the gratification. Where the challenge is not to get attached at any stage in the process. Yeah, I don't have much more to say about that than. What do you mean by control? Like, can we get the mic to him? Yeah, who has the mic? Yeah, that's your job, the runner. You're the mic runner, so you have to run to the next person whenever they talk. You're not doing your job properly.
So
yeah,
control their mind, control the urge.
yeah.
Also, in Tattva Buddha, for example, before the detachment comes, we talk about controlling our
Yeah.
Controlling.
Yeah.
Formally.
Oh, actually, I think what you mean is self-restraint. I think. Yeah, that might be a better way to put it. I just didn't understand control. Yeah, and we'll come back to Paul. Yeah, but can we give it to Paul? Yeah, because he had his hand up. Yeah.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Yeah.
My name is David. I had a quick question.
David,
about the
sorry.
Paradox of, what did you say? The paradox of
Instant gratification. Yeah.
So from moment to moment, as you're stuck in that paradox, it's hard to realize that you're actually in a paradox.
Yeah.
So in the tamasic nature of the mind, it's made of all three gunas. And maybe can we elaborate on techniques to realize that and to counteract, so you move that to a different level, maybe from tamasic to rajasic into the sattvic.
Okay, hold on. So your question is, it's hard to detect.
Yes, it's a
when we're
mind. And many people are in that path.
Yeah. Yeah.
Systems working the way they are.
Yeah. Right. I got you. Yeah. I mean, that's why I think that Swami Vivekananda's teaching is so important. The secret of life is not enjoyment, but education through experience. So he doesn't just say the secret of life is not enjoyment, but experience. It's education through experience. And how do we get educated by our experiences? Through mindfulness in the midst of our experiences. And it is a challenge. I mean, the temptation is to just go through our experiences kind of unmindfully, right? And so spiritual practice is about being mindful in the midst of those experiences. It's not easy, but if we don't learn the easy way, what does the easy way mean in this context? You undergo the experience once or twice, and then you learn from it and you stop, or you modify your life accordingly. The hard way is what? The way of suffering. The first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, the title is, anyone? Arjuna Vishada Yoga. Many people think that the Gita teaches 4 yogas only: Bhakti Yoga, Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, Raja Yoga. It teaches many more yogas than that. And one of the most important and powerful yogas is in chapter 1. It's the yoga of suffering, the yoga of depression, the yoga of dejection. Arjuna's spiritual life begins in terrible depression when he's almost contemplating suicide. How can I possibly kill my loved ones? Even if the war is just, even if I'm on the right side of justice. That's when his spiritual life begins. And for many of us, spiritual life begins with terrible suffering. Swami Vivekananda used to say, suffering is the great eye-opener. If we don't get educated through our experience in the normal route, we will when we hit rock bottom. I have friends in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, who tell me that I was very close to one of them. I still am. And he said that it was when he hit absolute rock bottom, when he was behaving terribly with his loved ones, when he could barely function, when he could barely get out of bed, that he dragged himself to AA. And the way he put it is, he said, the moment I walked in, he said, I had a white light moment. Some people, of course, it doesn't always work that way. Some people, it takes years of attending. And he said, literally, the moment I walked in, I had a white light moment. And his life just became spiritual. He got interested in my tradition. He visited me in India when I was in Bilumad. He got initiated in our tradition, and the rest is history. He's been sober ever since. But sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to climb back up again. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, my name is Digambar.
Digambar. Please keep the mic closer to your mouth.
Nice to go through this journey. I think one of the thought, I think Alan Watts put it, like even if you look at outside from the experience of others and you try to adopt it, no person in the whole world has like tried to do that, and he's not able to do that by just looking for the experience of others. So you, even if for your own experience, you have to go inside, and that is the way to start. So we start like talk about 3 stages of like how to live the life. But is it not like you look at the like the ideal one on the top most what you want, and you go first step itself, saying that now I have to start from that stage itself.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So you talk about like pleasant life, meaningful life.
The good life and then the meaningful life.
Yeah. Like if you know that the meaningful life is the destination, why someone should go through these 3 stages?
No, it's not like that. It's not like the good life. You can have components of pleasure in a fulfilling life, and the good life is essential to leading an ultimately meaningful life. So actually, the 3 things can go together. Your life should not be based primarily on maximizing sense pleasures and instant gratification. So, but it could still be, it doesn't mean you should never have dessert, enjoy yourself. No, that's not the point. But that can't be the be all and end all. And the good life and the meaningful life have to go together. You can't have a meaningful life without the good life. So it needs to combine. It's a common. The good life is an ultimately fulfilling life is one that combines the good life with the Vedantic correction of turning karma into karma yoga with a meaningful life based on some higher spiritual purpose.